Welcome to the first Sales Judgment Challenge. I'm Alen Mayer, and in each challenge, I will give you a realistic sales decision shaped by AI. You make the call first. Then we'll look at what makes the decision harder than it initially appears, and what better judgment looks like. Here's challenge number one, the perfect proposal. Here's the situation. A major prospect asks for a revised proposal by the end of the day, and you ask AI to revise the proposal and recommendation using your discovery notes, previous emails, and pricing. Minutes later, the proposal looks polished. The pricing is clear, the language is persuasive, and the recommendation is confident. Everything looks ready to send, and the deadline is approaching. So, what do? A. Send it. It looks ready and meets the customer's deadline. B. Verify the numbers and pricing, then send it. C. Review what the recommendation is actually based on before sending it. Or D. Ask the client for more time so you can validate the proposal properly. Make your choice. What would you do? Hold on to your choice. We'll come back to A, B, C, and D. But first, let's look at what makes this decision harder than it appears. AI doesn't need to be wrong for this to become a judgment problem. The proposal may be a perfectly reasonable recommendation based on the information available. But reasonable doesn't automatically mean ready to act on. You still have to decide whether the evidence is strong enough to justify putting that recommendation in front of your customer. And that's the judgment call. And you are responsible for the decision you make. And this is where AI changes the decision environment. It can take the information from discovery and turn it into a recommendation that is clear, logical, and persuasive. That's valuable, but improving the quality of the argument doesn't automatically improve the quality of the evidence behind it. The danger is becoming more confident in the recommendation simply because it has become more convincing. And this is where you need to look at what the recommendation is actually based on. Maybe the customer mentioned a problem, but never said it was the priority. Or maybe they expressed interest in a capability, but never said it would influence the decision. Maybe something you heard during discovery has quietly become a conclusion in the proposal. Those conclusions may be perfectly reasonable. But what the customer actually established and what we concluded from it are not the same thing. Judgment means knowing the difference before that conclusion becomes part of your recommendation. This is where AI can make that judgment harder. And I call this the coherence illusion. When an argument fits together beautifully, it's easy to give the conclusion more confidence than the evidence underneath it deserves. AI makes that especially important because it can produce coherence, clarity, and confidence remarkably well. The recommendation may deserve your confidence, but the polish itself isn't evidence that it does. Before AI, as you know, poor thinking often came with visible warning signs. Weak writing, inconsistent logic, we all did it, and confusing structure. Those flaws didn't guarantee that thinking was wrong, but they often slowed us down and gave us a reason to question it. Now AI changes that. Incomplete thinking can now arrive exceptionally well written, logically structured, and confidently presented. The warning signs that once made us stop and inspect the reason can be much, much harder to see. And that's why accuracy alone isn't enough. The facts can be right, the numbers can be right, and the assumptions the recommendation depends on can still be untested. Accuracy tells us whether the information is correct. It doesn't tell us whether that information is strong enough to justify the recommendation. And in sales, and you know that distinction has a commercial consequence. Once an untested assumption shapes the scope, pricing, promised outcome, or recommendation, it isn't just part of your internal thinking anymore. It's becoming part of what you are asking the customer to buy and what your organization may be expected to deliver. This is the distinction I want you to remember. Verifying is not the same as judging. Verification asks, is the information correct? Judgment asks, does the information justify the recommendation? Both matter, but they are not the same thing. So before you approve an AI-supported recommendation, ask one simple question. What would have to be true for this recommendation to be right? That question takes your attention away from how convincing the proposal sounds and puts it back on what the recommendation actually depends on. Now, turn that distinction into a practical check. Separate what you know from what you are assuming. What is supported by the evidence you have, and what are you inferring? An assumption isn't automatically wrong. Every sales decision involves some uncertainty. The important thing is knowing when your recommendation depends on something you haven't established yet. Before you send it, ask yourself 3 questions. What will have to be true for this recommendation to be right? Which of those things did the customer actually confirm? And if one of my assumptions is wrong, would I change the recommendation? That last question matters. You don't need to investigate every assumption equally. You need to identify the assumptions that could materially change what you are recommending. If an assumption doesn't affect the recommendation, it may not deserve much attention. But if getting it wrong would change the scope, pricing, promised outcome, or recommendation, that's an assumption worth testing before it reaches the customer. So let's get back to the original question. What would you do? And what would I do? I would choose C. Review. Review what the recommendation is actually based on before sending it. And it's not because AI is unreliable, far from that. And not because every assumption has to be eliminated. But because before I put the recommendation in front of the customer, I want to know whether the evidence underneath it is strong enough to justify what am I actually recommending. So here is the lesson. Don't let an unverified assumption hide inside a customer recommendation. That doesn't mean eliminating uncertainty. Sales decisions rarely give you that luxury. It means knowing what is established, what is inferred, and whether the evidence is strong enough to support what you are recommending. A well-written proposal is not necessarily a well-reasoned proposal. Don't just verify the output. Test the thinking behind it. And if you want a simple way to apply this to your next proposal, remember these 3 things. First, test what must be true for the recommendation to hold. Second, separate what the evidence establishes from what you are assuming. And third, decide what that evidence actually justifies you recommending. Accuracy tells you whether the information is correct. Judgment determines what the information justifies you doing. Better judgment isn't about questioning everything AI gives you. It's about knowing what deserves to be trusted, what deserves to be tested, and what you are prepared to act on. I'm Alen Mayer, and follow me for the next Sales Judgment Challenge.